Hey everyone, today we are looking at the decline of the Qing Dynasty in China. Objectives include being able to explain what internal and external pressures led to the decline of the Qing Dynasty and summarizing how Western nations increased their economic involvement with China. Any weaknesses China had were made worse by the country's rapid population growth. By 1900, there were 400 million people in China, and food shortages were very common. External pressures, whether they were militaristic, economic, or ideological, only hastened the end of the Qin dynasty. Lost track here where I'm at. By 1800, Europeans had been in contact with China for more than 200 years. European merchants, however, were restricted to a small trading outlet, at Guangzhou. Guangzhou was referred to as Canton by the West. The British did not like being restricted to only Guangzhou. They also felt that there was a trade imbalance between the two countries. They bought a great deal of goods from China, but China had little use for British goods. Britain imported tea, silk, and porcelain from China, and all the Chinese wanted from Britain was cotton. China would have to buy a lot of cotton to equal the value of the goods that they got from Britain or that they sent to Britain. So Britain wound up paying for most of their imported goods with silver. However, Britain eventually found a product that many Chinese people wanted: opium. Demand for opium, a highly addictive drug that the British East India Company cultivated in northern India, skyrocketed in South China. Instead of silver being sent into China, it was now flowing out of China and into the pockets of the officials of the British East India Company. Opium was illegal in China, but that did not stop the British from exporting it to China. The Chinese government even sent a written plea to Queen Victoria, but it fell on deaf ears. As a result, the Chinese blockaded the foreign area of Guangzhou in hopes to force British traders to surrender their chests of opium. This did not work out as China had planned, and it led to war with Britain. This war was called the Opium War, and it started in 1839. Now, the Chinese were no match for British warships, and the British Navy laid waste to China's coastal and river forts. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The Chinese agreed to open 5 coastal ports to British trade, and China even gave Britain the island of Hong Kong. China also agreed to limit the taxes that they would impose on British goods um, that were being brought into China, and the treaty did not even address the opium trade. Um, Also, in the 5 ports, Europeans lived in their own sections and were not subject to Chinese laws, but to their own laws, a practice known as extraterritoriality. The Taiping Rebellion was a peasant revolt that happened because the Chinese government could not deal with internal economic problems. Shu Chan, Hong Shu Chan, led the rebellion, and he was an interesting character to say the least. He was a Christian convert who viewed himself as the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and Hong was convinced that God had given him the mission of destroying the Qing dynasty. Joined by a crowd of peasants, Hong captured the town of Yongang and proclaimed a new dynasty, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, or Taiping Tiangyao in Chinese, hence the name Taiping Rebellion. Now, people kind of dug the rebellion because it called for all kinds of social reforms, including giving land to all peasants and treating women as equals of men. Women actually served in their own units in the Taiping army. Hong's idea would be that all people would share money, food, and clothing equally amongst each other. He outlawed tobacco, alcohol, and he eliminated the practice of foot binding. In March of 1853, the rebels seized Nanjing, the second largest city of the empire, and they massacred 25,000 men, women, and children. The revolt continued for 10 years, but then it gradually began to fall apart, but not before 20 million people had been killed. By the late 1870s, the Qing dynasty was in decline. A group of reform minded officials argued that China should adopt Western technology while holding on to Confucian values and institutions. This idea was called self strengthening. Under this policy, factories were built to produce modern weapons and ships, increasing China's military strength. Some reformers wanted to introduce democracy, but such ideas were far too radical for most people. Railroads, weapons factories, and shipyards were built, but the Chinese value system remained unchained. That should be unchained. Unchanged. Boy, oh boy, I'm having trouble tonight, folks. All right. In the end, the changes that helped modernize China did not help the Qing stay in power. European powers spent the last 2 decades of the 1800s advancing into China, while internal conditions continued to deteriorate. Russia took advantage of the dynasty's weakness to force China to give up territory in the north, which is now Siberia. Even more ominous changes were taking place in the Chinese heartland. European states began to create what they called spheres of influence, where they had exclusive trading rights. After the Taiping Rebellion, regional warlords and not the central Chinese government began negotiating directly with foreign countries. In return for money, these warlords granted European and Asian countries the exclusive rights to buy and sell goods, build railroads, and mine. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan all established spheres of influence in China. This scramble for territory took place during a time of internal crisis in China. The young emperor Guang Xiu launched a massive reform program based on changes that Japan was undergoing to westernize its society. Xiu's 100 days of reform included major political, administrative, and educational reforms. China would adopt a new educational system based on Western-style schools, and they would also have banks like the West and a free press. The Chinese military would be trained to use modern weapons and Western-style fighting techniques. Many conservative government officials opposed these reforms because they saw little advantage to copying the West. One administrator commented that the adoption of foreignism leads to disorder. These conservatives felt that traditional Chinese rules needed to be reformed, not rejected, in favor of Western changes. Next, we have the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were members of a secret society called the Society of Harmonious Fists. Members of the Boxers practiced a system of exercise called shadow boxing, or boxing with an imaginary opponent, and they actually thought that this would protect them from bullets. The Boxers were really upset by the foreign takeover of Chinese land. Their slogan was "Destroy the Foreigner," and they especially hated Christian missionaries and Chinese converts to Christianity. To them, these people threatened Chinese traditions. At the beginning of the 1900s, bands of boxers would roam the Chinese countryside, and they would slaughter foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians. What happened was an allied army consisting of 20,000 British, French, German, Russian, American, and Japanese soldiers attacked Beijing and helped the Chinese government restore order. The foreign forces demanded that the Chinese government pay an indemnity, a payment for damages sustained, to the powers that crushed the Boxer uprising. Now the imperial government was weaker than ever.